The entire history of Babylon is not merely the story of a city. It is the story of civilization itself. On the plains of ancient Mesopotamia, along the slow-moving waters of the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq, Babylon began as a small settlement, just one among many city-states scattered across the cradle of human history. Yet from these modest origins, it rose to become the greatest metropolis of the ancient world, a symbol of empire, innovation, and the human desire to touch eternity. Long before Hammurabi's laws were carved in stone, Babylon appeared in the records of the Akkadian kings. Its name, Babilu, meaning Gate of the Gods. It was a city destined to rule time itself. Around 2300 BCE, under the shadow of the mighty Akkadian Empire, Babylon was little more than an administrative town. But history would remember it as far more. When the empire collapsed, the land fell into chaos, and out of that chaos, Babylon began to rise. By the early 2nd millennium BCE, Amorite chieftains took control, forging a dynasty that would transform this humble city into an imperial power. Then came Hammurabi, the ruler who unified Sumer and Akkad, who made Babylon the beating heart of Mesopotamia. His code of laws, etched in basalt, laid one of humanity's first legal foundations, and his empire stretched across the fertile lands of the south. Under his reign, Babylon became not just a city of kings, but the center of human order itself. Yet empires fade. In 1595 BCE, Hittite warriors descended from the north and plundered Babylon, leaving behind a scar that would mark the city's long history of rise and fall. Foreigners, the Kassites, would later rule, preserving Babylon's culture even as its power waned. For centuries, the city endured under distant masters, Elamites, Assyrians, and others who coveted its name, its gods, and its glory. But Babylon was never a city that remained silent for long. In 626 BCE, Nabopolassar, a Chaldean prince, rose in revolt against Assyria and reclaimed Babylon's independence. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would make it shine brighter than ever before. Under his rule, the Neo-Babylonian Empire built wonders that would echo through eternity: the towering Ishtar Gate, the processional way, and the legendary Hanging Gardens. Babylon became the marvel of the known world, a place where mathematics, astronomy, and architecture flourished, where power was matched only by beauty. Yet power invites envy. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia entered Babylon without a fight. The city's walls remained standing, its temples untouched, but its sovereignty was gone. For 2 centuries, it served the Persian kings, then the Macedonian conqueror Alexander the Great, who dreamed of making it the heart of a new empire. But he, too, met his end here, in 323 BCE, within the very walls he sought to restore. After Alexander, Babylon slowly faded from history. The Seleucid rulers built new cities, and the population drifted away. By 100 CE, the once mighty Gate of the Gods lay silent, its ziggurats crumbling under the desert wind. Yet its memory endured, in scripture, in legend, and in the languages of those who came after. Babylon became an idea, the eternal city of ambition and downfall, of wisdom and warning. And so, to understand the entire history of Babylon is to look back not only at its kings and empires, but at the enduring legacy of what it meant to be human, to build, to rule, and to remember. This is where the history of Babylonia that we read today begins. In the heart of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers bend and divide the land into a network of fertile plains, there once stood a modest town. It was not yet a name to command empires, nor a city to draw tribute from kings. It was simply Babilu, a word in Akkadian meaning gate of the gods. The earliest known reference to this place appears during the reign of Sargon of Akkad, circa 2334, 2279 BCE. Sargon had carved the first empire in recorded history, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His rule unified the city-states of Sumer and Akkad into one domain, creating what scholars now call the Akkadian Empire. Among the many towns recorded in the empire's administrative texts, Babylon was mentioned as a minor settlement, an administrative outpost on the trade routes that linked the southern and northern regions of Mesopotamia. At this stage, Babylon was neither a capital nor a center of culture. It was one of many towns in the vast machinery of Akkadian rule, a network of fortified sites, storehouses, and temples that maintained Sargon's authority. Yet, even in its smallness, the seeds of greatness were present. It stood near the heart of Mesopotamia, along a strategic corridor between Kish, Sippar, and Borsippa, an area that would, in time, make it a natural gathering point for trade, faith, and power. When Sargon's dynasty collapsed around 2154 BCE, the empire that had bound the region together disintegrated. Internal rebellions, invasions from the Zagros Mountains, and pressure from the Gudi tribes shattered Akkadian unity. The once-ordered world fell into what later scribes called the dark time between kingdoms. Across Mesopotamia, ancient cities rose and fell in quick succession. Uar, Uruk, and Isin each claimed supremacy at different moments. The third dynasty of Uar, circa 2112, 2004 BCE, briefly restored order under kings like Uar-Nammu and Shulgi, whose rule revived Sumerian writing, architecture, and centralized administration. But this Sumerian renaissance was short-lived. As Uar's power waned, new peoples entered the scene. Among them were Amorites, Semitic-speaking nomads from the western deserts of Syria and the Levant. To settled Mesopotamians, the Amorites were outsiders, pastoralists who moved with their flocks and whose dialect differed from the old Sumerian and Akkadian tongues. Yet they were ambitious and adaptable, and in time, they would shape the destiny of Babylon itself. Between 2000 and 1900 BCE, Mesopotamia fragmented into a mosaic of small kingdoms. The old city-states revived, each ruled by Amorite dynasties that blended local traditions with their own tribal leadership. In this new order, cities such as Isin, Larsa, Eshnunna, and Mari competed for dominance, forming alliances and breaking them with equal ease. Babylon, still modest in size, stood on the edge of these struggles. Its position along key river routes made it strategically valuable. Control of Babylon meant control of the central plain between Sumer in the south and Akkad in the north, a region that bridged the two worlds of Mesopotamian civilization. By this time, the god Marduk had already begun to emerge in Babylon's local pantheon. Originally a minor deity associated with magic and water, Marduk's temple, the Sagila, stood near the heart of the settlement. Over centuries, this god would rise to dominate the Mesopotamian pantheon, becoming the supreme deity of creation and order. His ascent mirrored that of the city itself. The Babylon that existed around 1900 BCE was still a provincial town, probably no larger than a few thousand inhabitants. It was built of sun-baked mud brick, walls, houses, and ziggurats shaped by hands that had learned their craft in Ur and Akkad generations earlier. Life revolved around the temple, the market, and the irrigation canals that sustained the surrounding fields. Farmers brought barley, dates, and fish from the riverbanks, while craftsmen shaped clay tablets and traded copper tools from the Gulf. Then came a turning point. Around 1894 BCE, an Amorite chieftain named Sumuabum seized Babylon and declared himself king. Little is known about his early life, but from the surviving chronicles and year names inscribed on tablets, we know that his reign marked the city's first step toward independence. His claim to power was significant. In a land long dominated by Sumerian kingships and ancient priestly dynasties, a newcomer from a tribal background had taken one of Mesopotamia's ancient seats of settlement and made it his own. Sumuabum's victory was not achieved in isolation. Across the plains, Amorite leaders were establishing dynasties of their own: Ishmi-Dagon and Ison, Samsoluna and Larsa, and Shamshidad and Assur. Each city was a potential rival, and the balance of power constantly shifted. Babylon, small and newly independent, had to assert itself carefully among these greater forces. The rise of Sumuabum's dynasty marks the beginning of what historians call the Old Babylonian period. The Amorite kings who followed him, including Sumalel, circa 1880, 1845 BCE, Sabium, and Apel-Sin, gradually consolidated control over the surrounding region. They expanded irrigation, fortified the city's walls, and strengthened the temples that anchored Babylon's religious authority. Through diplomacy and calculated warfare, they extended their influence across central Mesopotamia. During these early years, Babylon's rulers laid the groundwork for what would become the city's enduring strength, a fusion of military skill, divine legitimacy, and administrative efficiency. They understood that power in Mesopotamia was not held by armies alone. It was written in clay, in tablets recording contracts, rations, and decrees, and it was sealed by the gods who watched from their temples. Cuneiform scribes flourished once again in Babylon, maintaining records in both the Akkadian language and the emerging Old Babylonian dialect. The city's archive houses grew with lists of officials, temple inventories, and trade documents. These were the instruments through which the Amorite kings transformed a town into a state. By 1830 BCE, Babylon had grown significantly. Its canals reached deeper into the surrounding countryside, feeding a network of villages and farms that supplied the city with grain and livestock. The temple economy was expanding, and the city's craftsmen produced goods that traveled as far as Elam and the Levant. Its population had likely tripled since the time of Sumuabum's conquest. Yet the region remained unstable. Wars erupted between Larsa and Ison, between Mari and Eshnunna, and between the rising Assyrian forces in the north. Each conflict offered both danger and opportunity for Babylon. Its rulers maneuvered between alliances, sometimes joining one side, sometimes another, carefully waiting for the moment when the balance of power would shift in their favor. That moment would come in the following century, when one of Sumuabum's descendants, a king named Hammurabi, would transform Babylon from a provincial power into the heart of an empire. But in these early days, the city's foundation was being laid in the quiet persistence of its builders, its scribes, and its priests. Babylon's story began not with conquest or grand monuments, but with survival. the ability to endure in the space between empires. For over 400 years, from its first mention under Sargon to its rise under Sumuabum, Babylon existed as a witness to the cycles of Mesopotamian history. Empires rose and fell, rivers shifted their course, and gods gained or lost their favor. Through it all, this small city held its ground on the fertile banks of the Euphrates, waiting for its time to come. By 1894 BCE, that time had arrived. Sumuabum's dynasty established Babylon's first royal line, and with it, a new identity began to form. The city that had once been a provincial outpost now carried a destiny larger than its walls could contain. Its name, Babilu, the Gate of the Gods, would soon become more than a name. It would become a symbol of civilization itself. In the centuries after Sumuabum declared Babylon's independence, his successors began shaping a state that would soon eclipse all others in Mesopotamia. Small at first, confined to the plains between the Euphrates and Tigris, Babylon grew through shrewd diplomacy and selective warfare. But it was under one man, Hammurabi, that the city rose from a regional power to an empire whose laws, language, and culture would echo across time. Hammurabi ascended the throne in 1792 BCE, inheriting a kingdom surrounded by rivals, Larsa to the south, Mari on the Euphrates, and Ishnana to the east. Each city-state had its own gods, kings, and ambitions. Hammurabi's genius was not only in arms, but in statecraft. For the first 2 decades of his reign, he avoided open conflict, forming alliances and strengthening his realm. He restored irrigation canals vital for agriculture, fortified the city's walls, and reorganized provincial administration. Babylon was becoming the center of a disciplined and efficient state. Then, around 1763 BCE, Hammurabi struck. In a series of rapid campaigns, he defeated Larsa and absorbed its wealth, subdued Ishnana, and crushed Mari, one of Mesopotamia's great cities, after uncovering its secret plots. When the dust settled, the lands of Sumer and Akkad, long divided since the fall of the old empires, were united once again under a single crown. Hammurabi ruled from the Persian Gulf to the upper reaches of the Euphrates. Yet his legacy was not built solely on conquest. He sought to create order through justice, to establish a moral foundation for rule. Around 1754 BCE, he commissioned a vast code of laws, carved into black diorite and set up in public view. The Code of Hammurabi survives today, one of the earliest complete legal texts in human history. It contains nearly 300 laws regulating trade, property, wages, family, and punishment. Its prologue invokes the gods. When the lofty Anu, king of the Anunnaki, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, gave rule to Marduk, they made Babylon great among the lands. Hammurabi described himself as the shepherd of the people, chosen by the gods to bring justice and protect the weak from the strong. The punishments were severe, yet the intent was order, a divine balance between wrongdoing and consequence. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became more than a political capital. It became the heart of civilization itself. Its temples rose higher, its processional streets lined with carved lions and bulls. The cult of Marduk, once a local deity, now stood supreme. The great Asagila temple complex became the center of worship for all southern Mesopotamia. Priests, scribes, and astronomers gathered there, recording omens and celestial movements that shaped Babylonian science for centuries. The empire prospered on trade. Caravans carried copper from Oman, tin from the Zagros, and lapis lazuli from distant Afghanistan. From Babylon's docks, goods flowed along the Euphrates to every corner of Mesopotamia. Farmers thrived under irrigation, artisans worked in bronze and clay, and merchants inscribed their accounts on baked tablets that still survive today, fragile witnesses to the city's golden age. But even empires forged by genius are not eternal. After Hammurabi died in 1750 BCE, his heirs struggled to maintain unity. Rebellions flared in the outer provinces. Rival kings in the north and east regained strength. Over the next century, Babylon's control weakened. Then, in 1595 BCE, the unexpected came. From the mountains of Anatolia, the Hittite king Mursalai led a sudden and devastating raid. His forces stormed Babylon, looted its treasures, and carried them back north. The attack was brief, but it shattered the old Babylonian state. When the Hittites withdrew, power in Mesopotamia shifted once more. Out of the highlands to the east came a new people, the Kassites. They would rule Babylon for centuries, preserving its name, its temples, and its traditions even as the old empire faded into memory. But Hammurabi's shadow endured. His laws, written in stone, would be studied, copied, and revered long after the city's towers had fallen. His reign marked the moment when Babylon became not just a city of kings, but a symbol of justice, authority, and the enduring idea that order could rise from chaos. When the smoke cleared after the Hittite raid, Babylon lay wounded but not destroyed. The invaders had come and gone, leaving behind a city stripped of its wealth and shaken by the collapse of the Hammurabi dynasty. Into this vacuum stepped a new power from the mountains east of Mesopotamia, a people little known before this age, the Kassites. They were not native to the southern plains. Their language was foreign, their origins obscure, and their arrival gradual rather than violent. At first, they appeared as mercenaries and settlers during the final years of Hammurabi's successors. In the decades that followed, they seized opportunity from chaos. By around 1570 BCE, a Kassite ruler had secured Babylon's throne and founded a dynasty that would last for nearly 400 years, longer than any before it. The Kassites did not seek to erase Babylonian culture. Instead, they absorbed it completely. They adopted the language of Akkad, worshipped the gods of Sumer and Babylon, and rebuilt the temples that war had destroyed. The Kassite kings styled themselves kings of Karduniash, their name for the land of Babylon, but in all ways they became Babylonian rulers. This was not an age of conquest, but of endurance. Across Mesopotamia, great empires rose and fell. Mitanni in the north, the Hittites in Anatolia, Egypt under the pharaohs, yet Babylon remained stable, a rare island of continuity in a world of turmoil. Kassite rulers established a new capital at Dur-Kirigalzu, northwest of Babylon, adorned with monumental ziggurats and palaces. But Babylon itself remained the spiritual heart of their realm, the seat of Marduk's temple and the axis around which their kingship revolved. It was a time of international diplomacy. Babylonian kings corresponded with the pharaohs of Egypt, the Hittite great kings, and the rulers of Mitanni. The Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt, preserve fragments of these exchanges. Written in Akkadian, now the lingua franca of diplomacy, they show Babylon as a respected peer among the ancient world's great powers. In these clay tablets, Babylon's kings negotiate marriages, request gold, and speak as equals to the rulers of faraway empires. Trade flourished. Caravans moved between Mesopotamia and the Levant. Merchants carried textiles, precious stones, and crafted goods. Babylon's temples regained their wealth and influence. Within the Sagala, priests performed the ancient rituals of Marduk, maintaining the sacred calendar and observing the stars. The Kassite period saw the refinement of astronomical records and the continued evolution of cuneiform scholarship. This was also an age of restoration. The Kassite kings repaired canal systems that fed the agricultural lands, rebuilt fortresses, and renewed the city's monumental architecture. Clay Kaduru stones, inscribed boundary markers, reveal details of land grants, taxation, and royal decrees. They depict the symbols of Babylon's gods, the spade of Marduk, the horned crown of Anu, and the crescent of Sin. Each stone served as both a legal record and a sacred oath. For almost 4 centuries, Babylon thrived in quiet strength. While Egypt's dynasties rose and fell, and the Hittites clashed with Assyria, the Kassites kept their hold through diplomacy, administration, and reverence for tradition. They understood that Babylon's power lay not in armies, but in continuity, in its ability to endure. But even a long peace cannot last forever. By the 12th century BCE, the balance of power in the Near East began to shift. To the north, Assyria was regaining strength. To the east, the Elamites, a rival kingdom beyond the Zagros Mountains, grew bolder. Internal strife weakened Babylon's rulers, and by 1155 BCE, the city faced a devastating blow. The Elamite king Shutruk-Nahani invaded Babylon. His armies stormed the city, looted its treasures, and carried away the sacred statue of Marduk, the very image of Babylon's divine protector. In Mesopotamian belief, the theft of a god statue was not merely plunder, it was the death of a city's spirit. For the first time in centuries, Babylon's divine heart was silent. The Kassite dynasty collapsed, its last kings overthrown, its legacy scattered. Yet the memory of their rule, 400 years of calm amid the chaos of the ancient world, would remain written in stone and clay, a testament to Babylon's remarkable capacity to absorb, adapt, and survive. The fall of the Kassites plunged Babylon into one of the most turbulent eras in its history. The Elamite invasion of 1155 BCE had shattered the city's defenses, stripped it of its divine image, and fractured the unity that had endured for centuries. In the aftermath, the land once called Karduniash broke into fragments. Rival dynasties rose, each claiming to restore Marduk's favor, each falling in turn to internal division or foreign pressure. For a time, Elam held sway over southern Mesopotamia, but their grasp was short. The peoples of the plains, Akkadians, Amorites, Arameans, rose in revolt. Around 1125 BCE, a Babylonian noble named Nebuchadnezzar I seized power and struck back against the Elamites. His victory was swift and decisive. He recaptured the statue of Marduk and returned it to its temple in Babylon, an event recorded in hymns and inscriptions as divine retribution. Nebuchadnezzar I became a hero in Babylonian memory. He restored the Sagala temple, revived ancient festivals, and reasserted Babylon's pride. Under his reign, the city experienced a brief cultural renaissance. The scribes resumed copying old epics, including the Epic of Gilgamesh, which they preserved in its canonical form. Yet the empire he rebuilt was fragile. After his death, his successors of the Second Isin dynasty struggled to maintain control over the fractious lands of Sumer and Akkad. As the 12th century BCE gave way to the 11th, Mesopotamia entered an age of wandering tribes and political decay. Aramean nomads swept down from the Syrian steppe, establishing small kingdoms along the Euphrates and in the fertile plains. Chaldean clans, Semitic peoples of uncertain origin, migrated into southern Babylonia, settling among the marshes near the Persian Gulf. Each group claimed pieces of Babylon's former territory, eroding the central authority that had once bound the region together. In the north, a new power was stirring. The Assyrians, who had once been Babylon's peers, began to expand aggressively from their heartland along the Tigris. During the reigns of Ashur-dan II and Adad-nirari II, their armies swept southward, reclaiming lands once lost to chaos. Babylon, weakened by internal rivalries, alternated between uneasy alliances and outright subjugation. By the 10th century BCE, Babylon had become a vassal kingdom under Assyrian dominance. Its kings were allowed to rule, but only with the approval of the Assyrian monarchs. This relationship was tense and unpredictable. When Babylon rebelled, Assyrian armies marched in. When they submitted, tribute flowed north. Yet even under this shadow, Babylon's cultural light did not fade. Within the city walls, life went on as it had for millennia. The priests of Marduk continued their rituals, measuring time by the movements of the moon and planets. The astronomers, the Upper Enuma Anu and Lil, maintained records of celestial phenomena, believing that the stars revealed the will of the gods. The Esagila temple complex remained the spiritual axis of Mesopotamia. Its rituals, codified over generations, continued unbroken through war and conquest. New kings still took the hand of Marduk during their coronation, symbolically receiving divine sanction. To the Babylonians, the gods had not abandoned their city, only tested it. Beyond the walls, the land changed hands repeatedly. Assyrian campaigns devastated fields and cities, leaving behind desolation and famine. Aramean and Chaldean tribes took advantage of the instability, carving out territories that would later become the foundation of new dynasties. Babylon endured in name, but its power was hollow. Archaeological records from this era are sparse. The city's monumental building projects ceased, and many archives were lost. Yet tablets recovered from outlying towns hint at continued scribal traditions and local governance. Even when the city's rulers were weak, its administrative system persisted, handling irrigation, land disputes, and temple economy. The centuries between 1155 and 900 BCE were thus an age of fragmentation, not extinction. Babylon had lost its empire, its independence, and its supremacy, but it remained alive in the heart of Mesopotamia. A city whose priests still recited hymns to Marduk, whose scribes still wrote in the ancient cuneiform script, and whose people still called their land by its sacred name. When the Neo-Assyrian Empire began its great expansion in the 9th century BCE, Babylon's fate was sealed. From that point forward, it would exist in the shadow of Nineveh, a proud but captive city, cherished for its culture and faith, yet forever caught between rebellion and submission. By the dawn of the 9th century BCE, the political horizon of Mesopotamia had changed beyond recognition. To the north, the Assyrian kings were transforming their state into an empire, disciplined, brutal, and relentless. To the south, Babylon stood as a diminished yet enduring symbol of an older order. Its fields still yielded grain, its scribes still wrote in cuneiform, and its temples continued the rituals that had once defined the spiritual life of the entire region. But beneath the solemn prayers to Marduk, there lingered resentment. Babylon had not forgotten its glory. Assyria's rise began under kings like Ashurnasirpal II, r. 883 to 859 BCE, and Shalmaneser III, r. 859 to 824 BCE, whose armies crushed neighboring kingdoms and stretched Assyrian power deep into the Levant. Babylon, though spared from outright destruction, found itself drawn into this orbit. Its kings were weak, its dynasties unstable, and its people divided between loyalty and rebellion. In the 8th century BCE, Assyrian expansion reached its peak. Under Tiglath-Pileser III, r. 745 to 727 BCE, the empire reorganized itself into a tightly controlled system of provinces ruled by governors loyal to Nineveh. When Babylonian rulers resisted, Tiglath-Pileser marched south and took the city. In 729 BCE, he crowned himself king of Babylon, attempting to merge the two thrones into one. It was a risky experiment. Babylon was not just another city to be ruled. It was a sacred place, the home of Marduk, whose temple, Esagila, was considered the spiritual center of the world. The Assyrian king could wear the Babylonian crown, but he could not easily win the loyalty of Babylon's priests or people. After Tiglath-Pileser's death, his successor Shalmaneser V reigned briefly before being replaced by Sargon II, r. 722 to 705 BC. Sargon tried to maintain control through diplomacy and force, but the southern tribes, especially the Chaldeans, resisted. One of their leaders, Merodach-Baladan, seized Babylon and ruled as king for over a decade, 721 to 710 BCE, styling himself as the defender of Babylonian freedom against Assyrian domination. Sargon eventually reconquered Babylon, but even in victory, he faced the same dilemma. The more Assyria interfered with Babylon's affairs, the more fiercely its people resisted. The Babylonians viewed their city not as a territory, but as a sacred trust. To them, Assyrian kings were usurpers, tolerated only so long as they respected Marduk's temple and the traditions of the New Year festival. Sargon's death in battle in 705 BCE was seen by many in Babylon as divine retribution. His son, Sennacherib, r. 705 to 681 BCE, inherited both the empire and its most persistent problem, Babylon's rebellion. From the moment he ascended the throne, uprisings flared across southern Mesopotamia. Chaldean princes, Elamite allies, and Babylonian priests united against Assyria's rule. For years, Sennacherib fought to suppress these revolts. In 689 BCE, driven by rage and frustration, he chose a path no Assyrian king had dared before: destruction. His armies descended upon Babylon, tearing down its walls, burning its temples, and flooding its canals. The city that had once been the gate of the gods was reduced to mud and ash. Sennacherib ordered that even the ruins be erased. He diverted the Euphrates River over the site, turning the city into a swamp. In Assyrian inscriptions, he boasted of wiping Babylon from the face of the earth. To his enemies, it was an act of sacrilege. To his people, it was blasphemy. Babylon was not just a city, it was sacred ground, and its destruction shocked the ancient world. When Sennacherib was murdered by his own sons in 681 BCE, many saw it as divine vengeance. His successor, Esarhaddon, r. 681 to 669 BCE, sought to undo the damage. He proclaimed himself restorer of Babylon, rebuilt its temples, and ordered the statue of Marduk, which had been removed or hidden, to be returned. The reconstruction was immense, taking years and thousands of laborers. By the time of his death, Babylon was once again rising from the ruins. Esarhaddon's son, Ashurbanipal, r. 669 to 631 BCE, completed the restoration. Under his reign, Babylon flourished as a provincial capital within the Assyrian Empire. The libraries were replenished, temples reopened, and scholars resumed their work. Babylon became both a symbol of Assyrian benevolence and a reminder of the empire's limits. For even at its most powerful, Assyria could never truly possess the heart of Babylon. Still, rebellion simmered beneath the surface. As Ashurbanipal aged, Assyria's grip began to loosen. In the south, new Chaldean leaders, descendants of the same tribes that had once defied Sargon, were gathering strength. Among them was Nabopolassar, a general with a vision to restore Babylon's independence and avenge centuries of humiliation. By the final years of the 7th century BCE, the tide was turning. The Assyrian Empire, overextended and exhausted, faced threats on all fronts. In 626 BCE, Babylon rose once more, not in quiet protest, but in open revolt. For the first time in generations, its people fought not merely for survival, but for sovereignty. The Assyrian yoke that had bound Babylon for nearly 3 centuries was about to be broken. From the ashes of subjugation, a new power was emerging, one that would soon build the most magnificent city the ancient world had ever seen. In 626 BCE, a spark lit within the ruins of Old Babylon. After generations of submission to Assyria, the city rose once more under the leadership of a Chaldean prince named Nabopolassar. He was not a man of royal blood, nor the descendant of the ancient kings of Hammurabi, but his ambition matched theirs. Born among the tribes of southern Mesopotamia, Nabopolassar had served under the Assyrians and witnessed their brutality firsthand. When he rebelled, he did so not as a warlord, but as a liberator. The rebellion began quietly, almost unnoticed, in the marshlands along the Euphrates. But within months, it spread like wildfire. Babylon's priests, weary of Assyrian domination, invoked the name of Marduk. Farmers and soldiers joined him, seeing in Nabopolassar's revolt the chance to reclaim what had been lost, not just independence, but dignity. Assyria, weakened by internal strife and civil war, underestimated the threat. In Nineveh, the Assyrian heartland was fracturing. The once great empire had been hollowed by decades of overreach. After the death of Ashurbanipal in 631 BCE, Assyria's unity collapsed. Rival generals and governors fought for power, draining the empire's strength. Nabopolassar seized the moment. He marched on Babylon, expelled the Assyrian garrisons, and proclaimed himself king. The date was November 23, 626 BCE, the day Babylon was reborn. Assyria responded swiftly. Its armies swept south, laying siege to Babylon. For more than a year, the city withstood the assault. Walls were battered, fields burned, but Babylon endured. Nabopolassar's leadership proved unyielding, and when the Assyrians withdrew, his position was secure. The gods, it seemed, had chosen a new ruler for the ancient city. In the following years, Nabopolassar turned his rebellion into a campaign of liberation. He forged alliances with other discontented peoples, the Medes from the Iranian plateau, the Scythians of the steppes, and Elamite contingents eager to see Assyria fall. Together, these forces formed a coalition that would change the map of the ancient Near East. The Great Assault on Nineveh began in 612 BCE. Babylonian chronicles describe a siege of ferocity and devastation. The Medes struck first from the north. Nabopolassar's forces closed in from the south. For 3 months, they encircled the Assyrian capital. Then, as if by divine will, the city's walls gave way. Flames consumed the palaces of Ashurbanipal, the temples, the libraries, all the splendor that had once terrified the world. The Assyrian Empire, the iron colossus of the ancient age, was no more. From the ashes of Nineveh, the world's balance of power shifted. The victors divided the empire's spoils. The Medes took the lands of the north and east, while Babylon claimed the heart of Mesopotamia, Syria, and the lands that had once belonged to Akkad. Nabopolassar established a new dynasty, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, heir to the ancient kings of Sumer and Akkad, yet modern in ambition and reach. The rebuilding began immediately. Babylon, scarred by centuries of war, was restored on a scale unseen since Hammurabi. Massive walls rose along the city's perimeter. Temples were repaired. Canals and roads were cleared of centuries of neglect. Nabopolassar's inscriptions speak of his devotion to Marduk and his duty to revive the divine order disrupted by Assyria's tyranny. But his rule was not only about vengeance or restoration. Nabopolassar sought legitimacy. He invoked the ancient titles, King of Sumer and Akkad, Chosen of Marduk, Shepherd of the people. His government re-established the religious festivals that had once defined Babylonian life, particularly the Akitu, the New Year celebration. During this festival, the king would enter the Sigilla temple, take the hand of Marduk's statue, and symbolically renew the world's order. Trade revived with astonishing speed. Merchants returned to the markets, ships moved along the Euphrates, and artisans found patronage once more. The city became a center of wealth and movement. The surrounding lands, from Ur to Nippur, again recognized Babylon's supremacy. Across Mesopotamia, scribes began recording time not by Assyrian rulers, but by Nabopolassar's regnal years. Still, the war was not over. The remnants of the Assyrian army had regrouped at Haran, supported by Egypt, which feared the rise of Babylon and sought to restore a balance of power. Nabopolassar's campaigns against them continued for years, draining resources but strengthening unity among his followers. By 609 BCE, the last Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal II, made a final stand at Haran. Nabopolassar's forces, alongside the Medes, stormed the city. The battle was decisive. Assyria vanished from history, leaving Babylon once again master of Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar ruled for almost 2 decades after Babylon's liberation. He was not a conqueror in the mold of Hammurabi, but his achievements were profound. He restored independence, revived the cult of Marduk, and laid the foundations for an empire that would soon surpass even the glory of Hammurabi's age. In his later years, as age and illness slowed him, Nabopolassar turned power gradually over to his son, a prince whose name would soon become legend, Nebuchadnezzar II. Under him, Babylon would not only dominate Mesopotamia, but also rise to become the wonder of the ancient world. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE, Babylon stood renewed, the capital of a vast realm stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Levant, from the Zagros Mountains to the deserts of Arabia. The city that had been conquered, burned, and erased was now the heart of civilization once again. The Assyrian yoke was broken, and the gate of the gods had reopened to the world. When Nabopolassar died in 605 BCE, his son Nebuchadnezzar II inherited more than an empire. He inherited the dream of a civilization reborn. Nebuchadnezzar was not merely a soldier or ruler. He was a builder, a visionary determined to make Babylon the center of the world once again. His reign would define an era, one that scholars still call the Golden Age of Mesopotamia's final empire. Nebuchadnezzar's first act as king came not in ceremony, but in battle. Even before his father's death, he had commanded Babylonian forces against Egypt and the remnants of Assyria at Carchemish, on the banks of the Euphrates. There, in one of the most decisive battles of the ancient world, Babylon crushed the combined Egyptian-Assyrian army. The victory ended Egypt's ambitions in the Near East and established Babylon's supremacy over Syria and Palestine. The young king returned home not as a prince, but as a conqueror. From that moment, Babylon became the heart of an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. City after city fell under its dominion: Tyre, Sidon, Damascus, and Jerusalem. Tribute flowed into Babylon's treasuries: gold, cedar, lapis lazuli, and grain from distant provinces. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions speak of the gods granting him dominion over all peoples who dwell under heaven. Yet the king's ambition was not only to rule, but to immortalize his reign in stone and brick. He undertook one of the greatest building programs in ancient history. Babylon, already magnificent under his father, was transformed into a city of mythic splendor. Towering walls encircled it, so vast that ancient writers claimed chariots could race atop them. The Ishtar Gate, built with glazed blue bricks adorned with bulls and dragons, stood as a symbol of divine protection and royal power. Its brilliance dazzled all who entered the city. Through this gate ran the processional way, a grand boulevard lined with lions, sacred to Ishtar, leading to the Sagila, the great temple of Marduk. Within it rose the Edamananki, a towering ziggurat dedicated to the god of creation, believed by later generations to have inspired the story of the Tower of Babel. The ziggurat's 7 terraces reached toward the heavens, symbolizing the bridge between gods and men. Nebuchadnezzar's devotion to Marduk defined his kingship. Each year, during the Akita festival, he would take the hand of Marduk's statue, reaffirming his right to rule and ensuring the renewal of the cosmos. To him, Babylon was not merely a city, it was the earthly dwelling of the divine order. But Nebuchadnezzar was also a warrior king. His empire's stability depended on constant vigilance. The western provinces, particularly Judah, repeatedly rebelled against Babylonian rule. In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar marched on Jerusalem, capturing the city and deporting its king, Jehoiakim, along with thousands of skilled workers and nobles. Babylonian chronicles record the event with cold precision. The king of Babylon took the city and appointed a king of his choosing. Yet rebellion persisted. A decade later, in 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar returned to Jerusalem. This time, his vengeance was total. The city was burned, its walls torn down, and Solomon's temple, the spiritual heart of the Jewish people, was destroyed. The survivors were exiled to Babylon, marking the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, one of the most significant events in biblical history. In Babylon, these exiles found themselves in a city of astonishing grandeur. For them, the contrast between their ruined homeland and Nebuchadnezzar's empire must have been overwhelming. Yet it was during this exile that many foundational texts of the Hebrew Bible were written or compiled, a testament to how deeply Babylon's power shaped the ancient world. While his armies expanded the empire, Nebuchadnezzar's architects reshaped its capital into a symbol of divine kingship. The city's waterways were engineered with remarkable precision. Canals brought fresh water from the Euphrates, feeding gardens, temples, and homes. Some accounts, later preserved by Greek writers, describe a breathtaking wonder: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. According to legend, Nebuchadnezzar built the gardens for his queen, Amytis of Media, who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Terraced platforms supported lush vegetation watered by a complex system of pulleys and irrigation channels. Though archaeologists still debate their existence, the gardens became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a symbol of love, engineering, and royal magnificence. Nebuchadnezzar's reign lasted 43 years, a period of peace, prosperity, and cultural brilliance. Under his rule, Babylon became a magnet for scholars, astronomers, and priests. The city's scribes refined mathematical systems, recorded celestial movements with remarkable accuracy, and produced texts that influenced both Greek and Persian thought centuries later. Economically, the empire thrived. Agricultural reforms expanded food production, trade routes linked the Persian Gulf with Anatolia and the Mediterranean, and artisans crafted goods admired across the Near East. The Babylonian economy ran on a system of temples and merchant houses, institutions that combined religion, commerce, and administration into a seamless whole. Despite his achievements, Nebuchadnezzar's legacy was not without shadows. Babylonian texts suggest moments of arrogance and divine warning. In later Jewish and Christian traditions, he became a figure of pride and downfall, the king who defied heaven, only to be humbled by divine will. The Book of Daniel tells of a ruler driven to madness, crawling like a beast until he recognized the supremacy of God. While this account is theological rather than historical, it reflects how deeply his image was etched into the collective memory of the ancient world. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BCE, the empire he built stood unrivaled, powerful, cultured, and immensely wealthy. His successors inherited a realm at its zenith, yet also one heavy with the weight of his ambitions. Within Babylon's towering walls and sacred precincts, the seeds of decline were already sown. For all its splendor, the empire rested upon the will of one man, and when that will was gone, the structure he built would begin, slowly and silently, to fracture. When Nebuchadnezzar II died in 562 BCE, Babylon stood as the unrivaled power of the Near East. Its palaces glittered beneath the desert sun, its walls encircled a population of hundreds of thousands, and its gods were said to dwell within its towering ziggurats. Yet behind this brilliance lay fragility. The empire was held together by the singular vision of a monarch who had ruled for over 4 decades. With his death, that vision began to fade. His son, Amel-Marduk, known in biblical texts as Evil Merodach, inherited the throne. Historical records of his reign are scarce, but those that survive paint a troubled picture. He ruled for only 2 years before being overthrown in a palace coup led by his brother-in-law, Nabopolassar, a general and powerful noble. The rapid turnover hinted at what Babylon's future would hold: instability, intrigue, and a steady unraveling of the order Nebuchadnezzar had built. Nabopolassar, 560 to 556 BCE, continued the empire's architectural and military traditions. Inscriptions credit him with temple restorations and campaigns against the Western territories, perhaps to maintain control over trade routes that linked the Mediterranean to Mesopotamia. Yet his reign, too, was brief. Upon his death, his young son Nabopolassar ascended the throne but was quickly overthrown in another coup, this time by a man whose name would become infamous: Nabonidus. Nabonidus, 556 to 539 BCE, was unlike any Babylonian ruler before him. He was a scholar king, more interested in theology and ancient relics than in governance or conquest. He had a fascination with the moon god Sin, whom he worshipped above Marduk, Babylon's supreme deity. In a city whose entire political and religious order revolved around Marduk's cult, this was nothing short of heresy. Soon after taking power, Nabonidus began a series of decisions that alienated the priesthood and much of the Babylonian elite. He restored old temples in Haran dedicated to Sin and spent years excavating ancient foundation stones, the world's first recorded archaeologist perhaps, but his neglect of Babylon's traditional gods caused deep unrest among the powerful priestly families. Then came a decision that stunned his people. Nabonidus left Babylon. Around 552 BCE, he moved to Tema, an oasis city deep in Arabia, where he remained for nearly a decade. The reasons remain debated: perhaps religious retreat, illness, or an attempt to control Arabian trade routes. But his absence created a vacuum at the heart of the empire. His son, Belshazzar, ruled in his place, commanding armies and overseeing administration. Belshazzar's name would later echo through history in the book of Daniel, where he is remembered for the writing on the wall, a vision foretelling the fall of Babylon. While the biblical story is symbolic, it reflects a genuine truth. Under Belshazzar's co-regency, Babylon's authority weakened as its enemies gathered strength. To the east, a new power was rising, one that would soon eclipse all the empires of Mesopotamia. In 550 BCE, Cyrus II of Persia, known to history as Cyrus the Great, overthrew the Median Empire and united the Iranian plateau under his rule. His expansion was swift, disciplined, and strategic. Within a decade, Cyrus conquered Lydia and Anatolia and turned his gaze toward Babylon, the last great bastion of the old Mesopotamian order. Inside Babylon, discontent simmered. Many resented Nabonidus's absence and his favoring of Sin over Marduk. The city's priests longed for a ruler who would restore traditional worship. Cyrus understood this sentiment and used it to his advantage. As his armies approached, he presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, the chosen of Marduk who would restore the goddess' honor and the city's ancient rights. In 539 BCE, the Persian army advanced into Babylonian territory. Nabonidus returned from Tema, but found his kingdom weakened and divided. The decisive battle came at Opis, near the Tigris River. There, the Babylonian army faced the Persians, and suffered a crushing defeat. Babylon's defense collapsed almost instantly. What followed was one of the most remarkable conquests in ancient history, achieved with minimal bloodshed. The Nabonidus Chronicle, a Babylonian clay tablet, records that after the fall of Opis, Cyrus's forces marched unopposed toward Babylon. On October 12, 539 BCE, they entered the city, possibly by diverting the Euphrates River and passing through the river gates at night. The city surrendered without resistance. Nabonidus was captured. Belshazzar, according to some accounts, was killed. Cyrus himself entered Babylon days later to the acclamation of its priests and people. The conqueror went straight to the Sagila, the temple of Marduk, and offered sacrifices, declaring that he had been chosen by the god to restore order. It was an act of extraordinary political intelligence, the conqueror presenting himself as the protector of Babylon's traditions. To legitimize his rule, Cyrus issued one of history's most famous documents, the Cyrus Cylinder. Written in Akkadian cuneiform, it describes how Marduk guided Cyrus to overthrow Nabonidus and tyranny and bring peace to the people. The text declares freedom of worship and the repatriation of displaced peoples, including the Jews, who were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This policy of tolerance and restoration transformed Cyrus into a figure celebrated not just in Persia, but throughout the ancient Near East. For Babylon, however, it marked the end of independence. Though the city would remain a vital center of learning and culture for centuries, its political sovereignty was gone. Under Persian rule, Babylon retained much of its prestige. It became one of the empire's key administrative centers, and Persian kings, such as Darius I and Xerxes, continued to fund its temples and respect its religious heritage, at least initially. However, the age of Babylon as a world power had come to a close. The city's fall in 539 BCE symbolized more than a political conquest. It marked the passing of a civilization that had shaped human history for nearly 2 millennia, from the days of Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi's laws to the splendors of Nebuchadnezzar's golden age. The walls still stood, the ziggurats still reached for the heavens, but the voice of Babylonian kings, the voice that once spoke for the gods, was silenced forever. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon in October of 539 BCE, he did so not as a destroyer, but as a restorer. The city's gates opened without battle, and its people, weary of Nabonidus's neglect, greeted the Persian as the chosen of Marduk. In his proclamations, Cyrus honored Babylon's gods, reinstated temple rites, and assured the priests that their city would remain sacred. The Persian conqueror understood that Babylon's greatness was not only in its walls or armies, but in its ancient prestige, a prestige he sought to claim rather than crush. In the early years of Persian rule, Babylon flourished. The Cyrus Cylinder, discovered centuries later, immortalized his policy of tolerance and restoration. He allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, restored sanctuaries across Mesopotamia, and presented himself as the legitimate successor to Babylon's kings. To the Babylonians, this approach preserved their pride, even under foreign rule. After Cyrus died in 530 BCE, his son Cambyses II and later Darius I, 522 to 486 BC, maintained Babylon as a vital province of the Achaemenid Empire. The city's position on the Euphrates made it a key administrative and economic hub linking the Persian heartland with the West. Taxes and grain flowed through its canals. Scribes still wrote in cuneiform, and temple schools continued their ancient curriculum of astronomy, mathematics, and divination. Yet Babylon's loyalty was not always secure. The Babylonians saw themselves as heirs to a divine kingship stretching back to Hammurabi, and they resented the idea of being governed from faraway Persepolis. Twice during Darius's early reign, Babylon rebelled. The first rebellion, led by a man claiming to be Nebuchadnezzar III, briefly seized control of the city before being crushed. Another revolt, led by Nebuchadnezzar IV, followed soon after but met the same fate. These uprisings demonstrated Babylon's enduring pride but also its weakness. The age of local kings was over. Darius reorganized the empire into satrapies, and Babylon was absorbed into the larger administrative unit of Babyrush. Still, the Persian kings continued to honor the city's religious institutions. The Esagila Temple of Marduk remained one of the most important sanctuaries in the empire, and the Akita festival, marking the Babylonian New Year, was celebrated each spring with imperial blessing. The city's priests, scholars, and astronomers adapted to the new order. It was during this Persian period that Babylonian science reached a remarkable level of sophistication. Astronomers charted planetary movements with mathematical precision, and their records, the astronomical diaries, remain some of the most valuable scientific documents from antiquity. In the temple archives, generations of scribes continued to record omens, eclipses, and political events, preserving the city's intellectual tradition long after its political decline. When Xerxes I succeeded Darius in 486 BCE, relations between Babylon and the Persian crown began to sour. Another major rebellion erupted in 482 BCE, this time provoked by dissatisfaction with imperial taxation and interference in religious matters. Xerxes responded ruthlessly. Ancient sources suggest that parts of Babylon's fortifications were damaged and that the statue of Marduk, the sacred symbol of the city's divine power, may have been seized or destroyed. Whether literal or symbolic, Xerxes' actions marked a turning point. Babylon's sacred autonomy, which even conquerors like Cyrus had respected, was now broken. From this point, Babylon entered a slow decline. Its temples still functioned, its canals still carried trade, but its prestige had dimmed. By the 4th century BCE, it was a provincial capital, venerable, ancient, yet politically irrelevant. Then, in 331 BCE, the thunder of conquest returned to the Mesopotamian plains. Alexander III of Macedon, Alexander the Great, swept through the Persian Empire with astonishing speed. After his victory at Gaugamela, he marched south and entered Babylon without resistance. To the Babylonians, this foreign conqueror seemed to fulfill an ancient prophecy that a new ruler would come from the west to restore the city's glory. Alexander, perhaps sensing the symbolism, treated Babylon with reverence. He ordered the rebuilding of temples that had long fallen into neglect, including the great Edamananke ziggurat, believed by later writers to be the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. The Greek historians tell us that Alexander planned to make Babylon the capital of his world empire, a bridge between East and West. Under his rule, Babylon briefly revived. Soldiers, scholars, and traders from across the known world gathered in its streets. Greek engineers studied its canals, philosophers visited its libraries, merchants filled its markets with goods from India, Egypt, and the Mediterranean. For a fleeting moment, Babylon seemed alive again, its ruins echoing with new languages, its name once more synonymous with greatness. But destiny, as always, had other plans. In June 323 BCE, Alexander fell ill and died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, the same palace that had once housed the greatest kings of Mesopotamia. He was only 32 years old. The cause remains uncertain: fever, poisoning, or exhaustion, but his death in Babylon was seen by many as the city's final act of prophecy. The conqueror who had sought to restore its power died within its walls. After Alexander's death, his empire fractured among his generals, the Diadochi. Babylon fell under the rule of Seleucus I Nicator, who founded the Seleucid Empire. At first, the city retained some importance, but Seleucus soon built a new capital, Seleucia on the Tigris, about 50 kilometers away. The new city was designed on Greek urban principles: wide streets, open plazas, and fortified walls. Its construction drew away Babylon's population, artisans, and trade. As the Seleucid dynasty consolidated its rule, Babylon gradually emptied. Temples remained active, and cuneiform scribes continued their work, but each year the city grew quieter. The great ziggurat fell into disrepair, its bricks carried away by villagers to build new homes. The Euphrates, shifting its course, left the ancient docks dry. By the 2nd century BCE, the once great metropolis was little more than a shadow of its former self. In 141 BCE, the Parthians, a rising power from the northeast, captured the region from the Seleucids. Under their rule, Babylon finally passed into silence. The Parthians had little interest in reviving the old Mesopotamian centers. Their capitals lay further north and east. Babylon's temples still stood, but their priests grew old, their rituals sparsely attended. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a haunting story. Cuneiform tablets from the late Seleucid and early Parthian periods grow fewer, their handwriting weaker, their language increasingly archaic. The last known dated text from the Esagila temple belongs to this age, a record of offerings, perhaps made by a priest who still believed the gods would one day return. By the time the 2nd century BCE came to a close, the name Babylon referred not to a living city but to a memory, a place of ruins where shepherds grazed their flocks among fallen stones. The great ziggurat, once the stairway to heaven, was reduced to a mound of clay. The canals dried, the libraries turned to dust. Yet even in decline, Babylon's legacy endured. In Greek and Jewish writings of this period, Babylon appeared not just as a city, but as a symbol of power, pride, and divine judgment. The Hebrews remembered it as the place of exile, the Greeks as a marvel of antiquity. Later generations would speak of Babylon as the archetype of human ambition. By 141 BCE, the story of Babylon's living world had ended. The torch of empire had passed, first to the Persians, then to the Greeks, and finally to the Parthians. But the city that had once ruled all Mesopotamia left behind something indelible: the idea of civilization itself, written in clay, preserved in memory, and whispered through time. When the Parthians seized Babylon in 141 BCE, the city that had once been the heart of the world was already half a ruin. Its temples stood hollow beneath the sun, its canals choked with silt, and its markets were silent where once merchants from every land had bargained beneath the shadow of Marduk-es ziggurat. Yet even in decay, Babylon remained a sacred name, a ghost that still commanded reverence, and a ruin that still inspired awe. The Parthian Empire, which rose from the Iranian highlands, governed through a loose federation of vassal kings and ancient cities. Babylon, however, was no longer a capital worth restoring. The Parthians favored Seleucia on the Tigris, and later Ctesiphon, both closer to their eastern territories and their trade routes with Persia and India. Babylon lay forgotten on the fringes of empire, a relic of the deep past. Still, life lingered among the ruins. Archaeological evidence shows that small settlements persisted within the fallen walls, and the temples, though cracked and diminished, continued their rituals. The Sagila, the great temple of Marduk, remained active well into the Parthian period. Priests still offered incense, still recorded omens on clay tablets, and still looked to the heavens for meaning. But these were the last embers of a flame that had burned for 2,000 years. The scribes who wrote in Akkadian cuneiform were now part of a dying tradition. Greek was the language of administration, Aramaic the tongue of daily life. Cuneiform, the oldest script in the world, had become the speech of gods and ancestors, still written, but no longer understood by most. The last Babylonian astronomers continued their observations even as the city decayed around them. They charted the paths of the planets and recorded eclipses with mathematical precision, maintaining a chain of scientific knowledge stretching back to the time of Hammurabi. The astronomical diaries, discovered in the ruins, show that this work persisted until around the 1st century BC, nearly unbroken through dynasties, invasions, and empires. But as generations passed, the tradition faded. The schools are closed. The tablets ceased. By the 1st century BCE, the heart of Babylon had become a wilderness of broken walls and scattered villages. Greek geographers and Roman travelers who visited the region wrote of a land haunted by the memory of greatness. Strabo, writing in the early 1st century BCE, described Babylon as largely deserted, its walls vast but empty. The greater part of Babylon, he said, is so deserted that one would not hesitate to say the city has become a desert. The Jewish people, long since returned from exile, remembered Babylon as both a place of sorrow and of divine judgment. In their scriptures, Babylon became more than a city. It became a symbol of human pride, of an empire built against heaven. The prophet Isaiah had written centuries before, "Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah." To later generations, this prophecy now seemed fulfilled. Yet even as its stones crumbled, Babylon's name endured across cultures. The Greeks saw it as the archetype of civilization, a city of wonders and learning. The Romans, inheriting their knowledge, used the term Babylonia for the region, though they no longer saw the city as alive. In their literature, Babylon evoked immensity, decadence, and awe, a place of both grandeur and fall. By the 1st century CE, only a few inhabitants remained among the ruins, caretakers of shrines, small farming families, and aging priests who clung to their ancestral rites. The last known cuneiform tablet, dated to 75 CE, records a simple astronomical observation, a calculation of the positions of Venus and Jupiter. After this, the script disappears from history. The language that had once carried the voice of kings and gods fell silent forever. The final collapse of Babylon was not marked by conquest or fire, but by silence, a long, slow fading into dust. The Euphrates, once the artery of the empire, shifted its course and left the old river docks stranded. The ziggurat of Etemenanke, once towering toward the heavens, eroded into a mound of clay. Shepherds grazed their flocks over its remains, unaware that beneath their feet lay the foundations of human civilization. When early Christian writers later spoke of Babylon, they did so not as historians but as moralists. In the book of Revelation, the name Babylon the Great became a symbol of worldly corruption, a city fallen under divine wrath. The ruins of the real Babylon had become so completely absorbed by myth that few knew whether it had truly existed. For nearly 2 millennia, the site lay buried beneath sand and legend. Travelers in later centuries, Greek, Roman, Arab, and European, all spoke of the ruins, each blending history and myth. Some thought it was the Tower of Babel. Others called it the place where Alexander had died. It's a true story, inscribed on clay, that remained hidden beneath the soil until the 19th century, when modern archaeology began to uncover it once more. But in the age between 141 BCE and 100 CE, Babylon's long life finally ended. The city that had seen the rise and fall of Sargon, Hammurabi, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, and Alexander had outlived them all. It had been the stage on which humanity first built an empire, first wrote law, and mapped the heavens. And then, after nearly 2,000 years of glory, it yielded to the quiet of time. By 100 CE, Babylon was no longer a city of men, but a city of memory, its name surviving only in scriptures, myths, and the minds of those who still wondered how something so vast, so mighty, could vanish so completely. The story of Babylon, from its birth as a small Akkadian settlement to its death beneath Parthian rule, became a parable for civilization itself, that nothing made by human hands endures forever, but the echoes of greatness never truly fade. By the 2nd century before our era, the world that Babylon had once ruled had shifted beyond recognition. The empires that followed it, Persian, Macedonian, Seleucid, had each left their mark, and yet Babylon still lingered, a ghost of its former self, surviving not through conquest but through memory. The Euphrates still wound its way past her broken walls, but the city that once held the world's heart was now a shadow. When the Seleucid Empire began to falter in the 2nd century BCE, Babylon's fate fell into the hands of the Parthians, an Iranian power rising in the east. Around 141 BCE, their king Mithridates I took control of Mesopotamia, pushing out the Seleucids and declaring Parthian authority over the fertile plains once called Shinar. To the Parthians, Babylon was both prize and relic, a symbol of imperial legitimacy that no conqueror wished to see vanish entirely. They minted coins in Babylon, held occasional ceremonies there, but their true capital shifted north to Ctesiphon, closer to their heartland. Babylon remained, but only as a sacred ruin, a name used to claim ancient glory. Yet life did not end entirely within its crumbling streets. Clay tablets dated to the 1st century BCE still record the activities of Babylonian astronomers, the last heirs of a scholarly tradition that stretched back over 2,000 years. Within temple precincts like Esagila, priests still charted the motions of planets, keeping alive the mathematical precision that once guided kings. Even as foreign rulers governed from afar, these scholars continued to preserve Babylon's intellectual flame, copying and recopying the wisdom of the ancients onto fresh clay. The city, however, was dying. The Euphrates was changing course, drifting westward, leaving once prosperous canals dry. The great ziggurat of Etemenanke, the structure some believe to have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel, had long since collapsed into mounds of brick. By 50 BCE, reports from visiting Greeks and Parthians spoke of a Babylon half deserted. Its temples were falling, its palaces abandoned, and the hum of its marketplaces replaced by wind and silence. What had once been the beating heart of Mesopotamia was now a landscape of ruins. Still, Babylon endured in another form, in text and myth. The Hebrew exiles had carried their name westward, weaving it into their scriptures. To them, Babylon became not just a city but a symbol, the embodiment of pride, exile, and human ambition. The Babylonian captivity became shorthand for suffering and divine judgment, echoing long after the city's walls had turned to dust. In Greek and Roman literature, too, Babylon retained a strange allure. Herodotus had once marveled at her size. Strabo described her in decay. And in the Book of Revelation, Babylon was invoked as a cipher for Rome itself, the archetype of imperial arrogance. By the dawn of the 1st century CE, only fragments of the old city remained inhabited. The Parthian authorities maintained a small garrison, and pilgrims sometimes visited the temples that still stood in partial ruin. But the power of Babylon was gone. When Seleucia and Ctesiphon rose to dominance along the Tigris, trade and governance shifted north, leaving Babylon to crumble in the sun. Clay bricks from its ancient walls were scavenged for new buildings, and the grand processional way, once used for the Akitu New Year festival, was now a track for shepherds. The priests of Marduk, who had once presided over the fate of kings, continued their rituals for as long as they could. The last cuneiform texts from Babylon, written sometime in the 1st century CE, reveal a world barely holding on to memory. They record astronomical calculations, hymns, and omens written in a language already forgotten elsewhere. These tablets, among the final breaths of the cuneiform script, mark the end of Mesopotamian civilization's direct voice. After that, the stylus fell silent. In the Roman world, distant travelers and historians still spoke of Babylon as a place of wonder. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, described it as a great desolation, a city whose ruins testify to former greatness. To him, Babylon was already ancient beyond reckoning, a city swallowed by time. The name lingered not as geography, but as a symbol. Babylon as the eternal image of a fallen empire, a reminder of how power decays and memory persists. Archaeologically, the decline left layers of silence. The once bright bricks of Nebuchadnezzar's walls, glazed blue and gold, now lie buried beneath centuries of silt. Wild palms grew through courtyards that had once seen royal processions. The ziggurat's terraces, once visible for miles, were reduced to rubble mounds later known as Babylon Hill. The sounds of scribes scratching clay, of traders calling out prices, of worshippers chanting to Marduk, all faded into the dust of Mesopotamia. Yet Babylon's name refused to die. In Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions, it lived on as a symbol and a warning. To some, it represented sin and divine punishment. To others, human creativity and the desire to reach heaven. As empires rose and fell in later centuries, from Rome to Byzantium to Baghdad, the memory of Babylon whispered beneath them all, the first city whose fall was recorded and remembered. The final inhabitants of Babylon probably left around 100 CE, when the Parthian administration relocated the last temple archives to other Mesopotamian centers. The walls that had seen the triumphs of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, the conquests of Cyrus and Alexander, now watched only the slow reclamation of nature. By the time the Roman historian Curtius Rufus described the region, Babylon had become more legend than city, a vast field of ruins on the horizon, haunted by its own past. And still, in a way, Babylon endures. Its language survives in fragments of Akkadian texts, its myths in the stories of the flood, creation, and the tower. Its spirit survives in every civilization that built upon its foundations, in the laws that govern justice, in the stars we still name from Babylonian charts, in the calendar that measures our days. Even in ruin, it remains one of humanity's first attempts to order the chaos of existence, to build a city not only of brick but of meaning. By the close of the 1st century CE, Babylon's physical story had ended. The Euphrates no longer touched its walls. Its people had scattered to newer cities, and its gods were silent. But its idea, its name, and its shadow lived on. Babylon had transformed, from an empire of earth to an empire of memory, from a city of kings to a symbol carved deep into the story of the world.